I'm David de la Croix from the University of Louvain in Belgium, the French-speaking part, and I work as an economist in the School of Economics. My first topic is growth theory, so understanding the process behind growth, behind economic growth, and I focus essentially on everything which touches households, like education, demographic factors, human capital accumulation, and things like that. Then recently I specialize a bit more in demographic economics, which looks at the effect of economic conditions on demography. And by demography I mean mortality, fertility, marriage, and migration. And I also look at the consequences of these demographic trends on the economy. My role here is to participate to chapter 4, which is on growth or no growth. Probably one big question there is whether sustainable growth is something feasible and or desirable. As a specialist of theories of growth, I think I can contribute to highlight some mechanisms that were important in the past, wonder whether they will still be relevant in the future. And I would also like to introduce some demographic elements, because I think population is something very important, both in the past and in the future. But that's a very, very nice initiative, so I think I will learn a lot from my colleagues in the different fields. So for example, in my group, there are a lot of people coming from the environmental team, looking a lot at natural resources, energy, climate change, and so on. So that is very important, of course, to put it in the full picture. And maybe more generally, what I like is that it's an opportunity to really think about the long run. Because here it's really social change in the next decades, even. So it's important to have that perspective in mind and to put it. And maybe I think I would like to not to be too pessimistic, because so a kind of similar initiative is this climate change panel, and there are always very pessimistic and black, and so while here I think there is a lot of reasons to hope for social change, better conditions for people. So I think that touch is something I want to promote. Recently, I worked on several issues linking economic change, so growth, to demography, inducing social change. And maybe I can give 3 examples of how growth could affect social change through the demography. So growth usually leads to better health of the people, so people will live longer, and living longer, they have a long horizon compared to a world where people have a high chance of being dead at, say, 40. So they have a long horizon, and so that affects their choice. They would put more weight to the future. Maybe they will invest more, for example, in their own education, but it could be also in their farm, is their farmers, and so on. So that's one example on how growth affects social change. Another one on which we worked recently, it's the effect through marriage. So by a population in which people will be wealthier, and in particular where extreme poverty will be reduced, has some chance to see changes in marriage patterns, like a reduction in marriage forms known as polygyny, so one man with several women, which depends, we think, quite a lot on the fact that those women would be very poor if they stayed alone. So that's an important change, a social change. And also, for example, divorce, it's something that has a chance to change, that could be on the rise in a wealthier society, because it has a cost. But if we are richer, we could pay more easily for this cost to get rid of a partner, a bad partner, let's say. So those are two examples, and then maybe a third one, which is quite specific but interesting. It's about childlessness. So the fact that in any society, some women don't have children at all over their reproductive life. So in a poor society, you will have a lot of people not having children because they are very poor. They are subject to poverty-related diseases, and so they will stay kind of involuntarily childless because of poverty. Now, when a country develops, when education rises, people become richer, that kind of childlessness will progressively disappear. But another type of childlessness will appear. It's a kind of voluntary childlessness. So some very highly educated women will decide it's too costly for their career to have kids, and will stay childless. So in the field of growth, I think it's not very original what I will say, but the most important social problem, of course, is the gap between rich and poor countries, which is not just a gap in income, but it's a gap in education, in health, in women empowerment, in many other correlates of income. So that's one thing. And so in relation with the demographic change, so we know that growth has been accompanied everywhere by the so-called demographic transition, which is a drop in fertility and a drop in mortality too, but so people have much fewer kids now than in the past, except in sub-Saharan Africa, where there we see maybe the beginning of the drop in fertility, but it's not yet there. So here one big question is whether it will come fast or whether it will take. How long will it take? Or more generally, how long will it take for poor countries to grow sufficiently to achieve a big reduction of poverty and rise in education? The point we are now in the chapter, we said, okay, let us be very clear about the different views of the world one could have. For example, there is, so probably the classical view would be that technology will solve many problems, growth will continue, it will allow poor countries to catch up, we can redistribute the product of that growth, reducing inequalities. That's one paradigm, and within that paradigm there are some policy implications. But there are other paradigms. For example, the people coming from the environment literature, they face the question whether there is a limit to growth coming from the environment and climate change and so on. And this points to a model where maybe we will reach a maximum income, and maybe at some point income will decrease because of all the bad effects on climate. So we call that a Malthusian model, where we grow and then at some point we degrow and we go back to a kind of quite bad situation. So that paradigm, which is very different from the first one, will also require some specific policies which might be the same. Some could be the same across the two paradigms, some could be different. And so we would like to look at that. And then a third paradigm that is gaining weight recently, I think, it's a kind of Marxist paradigm, stressing that growth now is accompanied by rising inequalities, and that is not sustainable. So we should do something about this gap between the top 0.1% in a given society and the rest. Otherwise, we will run into social difficulties and maybe a revolution, and then the old Marx is coming back. And then that also calls for specific redistribution policies and so on. Maybe that would not be advisable in another paradigm. About the possibility of growth versus stagnation in the future, I'm kind of agnostic for the moment. So I'm curious to listen to the guys from the environmental sciences to see whether they really have good arguments to convince me that growth could come to an end. I don't know. A priori, I would say I do not imagine that technical progress will stop unless things become really very difficult and complex. But I could not think that human capital will stop accumulate, which are important drivers of growth. But we'll see that, I don't know. And it is very clear that from the point of view of the emerging countries, growth is important for them to reach a satisfactory level of development.